Back to the latest edition of On Point. We've been focusing so much on the Republicans, of course, the Iowa caucuses, New Hampshire primary, so on and so forth, and all the contestants involved. But we haven't focused too much on the Democrats. The reason being is it really wasn't much to talk about. But we do have had a South Carolina primary. And there's certain things I think we can glean from that, specifically in this point, President Biden and the black vote. I'm joined here, of course, by a political analyst extraordinaire and best-selling author Eric Ham out of Washington, D.C. And Eric, as you know, that most people have been talking about, we've seen surveys, we've seen polls, we've seen, a number of commentators, contributors saying that, Biden is in trouble with the black voters, specifically black males. We've seen recently Snoop Dogg and 50 Cent come out and saying, hey, they're Trump people for the most part. Where are we? What could we glean from the South Carolina primary, specifically when it comes to the black vote and Biden?
Well, I think not only can we glean something from the South Carolina primary, but also when you take that in combination with what took place in New Hampshire, we're seeing an incumbent president that is actually looking far stronger, much more dominant than what the narrative and certainly what the polls have been saying for quite some time. And then when you add to that Joe Biden's massive lead in the vaunted money race, what we're seeing here is an incumbent president who is going to be able to compete for the long haul, especially when we get to those vital 10 weeks in the fall when it's a race, not a sprint, not a marathon, to November. Now, back to South Carolina, as we have been hearing for quite some time, Julian, you and I, that black voters, particularly black men, have been moving away from Joe Biden and moving into the Trump camp. And it's not just a narrative that we have heard pushed throughout the media. I've actually seen it from Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz, who was actually speaking to Steve Bannon, saying that they believe they have inroads to black male voters to actually move them into the Trump camp. But now what we saw in South Carolina, even though the turnout was far more depressed or suppressed, I should say, than it was in 2020, because there's not really any competition. You've got Joe Biden, the incumbent president, against two virtual unknowns running in this state. And we know that South Carolina is like Joe Biden's Waterloo. It's where we know he does his best work. And what we saw in that race on Saturday was not only did Joe Biden win overwhelmingly, but when we look at the black vote in particular, Joe Biden actually received 13,000 more votes in this primary than he did back in 2020. So he's actually improved mightily with black voters. And so when you take that into account with the fact that he was a write-in candidate and still won by nearly 80 points in New Hampshire, you're seeing a president whose narrative doesn't match up with what we're actually seeing in terms of how people are voting. And I think that's going to be a troubling trend that we're going to continue to see play out, where people are looking at polling data, which we know is largely unreliable, particularly when you go back to 2020 and 2016, versus actually looking at the trend and how people are actually voting when they go to the polls. And what we are seeing is people are still getting behind Joe Biden in spite of or because of issues such as his age, or the fact that they think he may not have done or they may not have gotten all the things that they wanted from him. They're still sticking with him nonetheless.
Let's put polls aside for a minute here. I'm going to play devil's advocate. You could say that Jim Clyburn, who was basically galvanized the black vote with that snowball effect back in 2020, urging black voters to come out, those who might have been apathetic, and that made the case. But can we still consider what happened in South Carolina a litmus test for black voters and black males around the rest of the country?
Well, absolutely. I think you can. And the reason why is because this is a primary. And given the influence that Jim Clyburn certainly wields in South Carolina, 13,000 more African Americans did not have to come out in order for Joe Biden to win in this primary. He could have won with just 2,000 more African American votes. He could have just won with 500 more African American votes. But that's a dominant number when you're looking at 13,000 more than what you got in 2020. And especially when we're being told that this is going to be a race that's going to come down to every single vote. The fact that Joe Biden is actually doing, greater than 10,000 more in the South. And the South is going to be a place where this election is going to play very heavily. Not South Carolina. Certainly, we know that's reliably Republican country. But when you look at places like Georgia, Virginia, North Carolina, where now we see that Joe Biden has made North Carolina a priority. And of course, Florida. We know Democrats want to move Florida back into the Democratic column. So what we're seeing from Joe Biden is we're seeing him begin to put together this campaign that is going to focus on many of these so-called disaffected voters, specifically and particularly African American voters. And what we are seeing here is Joe Biden, at least right now, has the right stuff and what it takes to actually move the needle with those voters that are going to actually determine the outcome of this race.
So, basically what we may be looking at here when it comes to people who are voting for Trump, you've got two different factions here. You have MAGA voters, of course, his diehards, but then you also have folks that are voting basically based upon money. You have these two black rappers, at least in part, for Trump. Well, maybe they're voting for the economic thing because of their tax base. Does that play in anywhere here at all?
That's a really good point, because when we hear from celebrities, when we hear from particular influencers, we have to remember that these people are in a different category than the voters that Joe Biden has attempted to cater towards since actually becoming the nominee and eventually running and winning the presidency. Joe Biden has made his tenure in office and his campaigns about middle class and working class voters. He believes that the wealthy, the well-off, the well-to-do, they're going to be all right. They're going to be fine, both in a Biden economy and even in a Trump economy. But it's the working class voter, it's the middle class voter that Joe Biden wants to see their lot. He wants to see their economic situation far better than it was when he leaves office, than it was when he came into office. And that has been his focus. That has been his objective and his priority. And so when we hear from people like Snoop Dogg and 50 Cent, what they are saying is they know that when Donald Trump was elected, there were two things that Donald Trump did successfully. He was able to get conservative and far right leaning judges and on the courts. And he was also able to enact a massive tax cut for the wealthy. So for people like Snoop Dogg and 50 Cent. And of course, we know those tax cuts are actually going to expire in 2025. And who better than to put Donald Trump back in office to ensure that those very tax cuts that have benefited them are actually back in place to continue to benefit them for the years to come. Joe Biden, on the other hand, isn't running on tax cuts to benefit the wealthy, but he's looking at how can I create an economic environment that actually benefits the middle and working class.
You're setting the stage for, of course, the rest of this campaign. It's going to be a marathon, not a sprint at this particular point here. There are two things I see, or at least three things I see for the Republicans as well as the Democrats. For the Republicans, of course, we have Donald Trump and his legal woes, the indictments, whether or not any of those trials will come forward before the election. And then, of course, you have the money issues with the Republicans. They don't seem to have the money base that Joe Biden has at this point. On the Democratic side, though, their major issue seems to be messaging. You've got an economy that's strong, but a lot of people feel that it's not. Those are the three major things I see as we move forward here. Could you delve into that just a little bit?
No, that's absolutely right. When we talk about the money issue, we know that at the end of the year, the Republican National Committee, the RNC, run by Ronna McDaniel, that they have shown that they have a paltry $8 million on hand and heading into an election year. That's the least amount of money that the RNC has had on hand in their history. we know also that Joe Biden just recently held a fundraiser in Miami, Florida, where they raised $6.2 million, nearly all of the money that the RNC actually has on hand. In addition to that, we know in the fourth quarter alone of last year, Joe Biden reported raising $97 million. And oh, by the way, he, along with the DNC, have more money on hand right now than any Democrat in history, including Barack Obama, who we know was a fundraising machine. And we just got word that a political action committee tied to the Biden campaign has already prepared to spend $250 million
Wow.
in the fall election. And just to give us some context, we know that going into the election of 2020, when Donald Trump was in the White House, they already had amassed $1 billion campaign war chest. The problem is they somehow managed to mismanage and spend all of that money actually before heading into the all important fall election. So the last 10 weeks of the race, they were hemorrhaging money and were desperately needing resources to actually be able to compete, which is why we saw the Trump campaign doing so much of their campaign from the White House and, of course, using Air Force One because they simply didn't have the resources to compete. That is not going to be one of the challenges that the Biden camp is going to have. As you mentioned, their challenge is going to be creating a stagecraft and a narrative to show that they are able to compete to match the reality, not the myth that we're continuously seeing from the media in terms of where this race stands.
As we close here, I guess this is perhaps a rhetorical question, but this being Black History Month, for the 2024 election, how important is it for the blacks to come out, or the black vote in general, in terms of determining whoever wins this race?
Well, when you look at many of the states that are going to determine the outcome of this race, many of these states are where we see large percentages of African American voters. So in places like Georgia, where you, of course, we know in the Atlanta area, there are large swaths of African Americans. That is going to be crucial. In states like Michigan, where, of course, you have the Detroit area, also Pennsylvania and areas around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. These are places where you have large swaths of African Americans, and it's those states that are going to certainly determine the outcome of this race. Florida is another place where we know African Americans are going to need to turn out in order to win. That's why we've already seen in the state like Florida, where Ron DeSantis, the governor there, implemented Florida an election law enforcement force to actually go after people that they deemed were actually voting illegally as a way to try to suppress the black vote. And so what we're seeing right now is efforts to try to suppress that vote, because we know that vote, the African American vote, is going to be key and integral to whoever wins this race.
All right, let's end this reading of this particular episode here of On Point. And as we move forward here down the yellow brick road without Dorothy, Toto, and the Tin Man, it'll be Eric Ham, myself, and of course some invited guests from time to time to give everybody here insight. Thanks, Eric, for joining us, and all of you, thanks for tuning in. Again, if you really like what you're hearing, want to hear more, please subscribe to On Point with Julian, and we'll make sure that everything that you need and you want, we will get to you in a timely fashion. At that note, we'll see you soon.